In 1997, a patch of Indonesian swamp quietly released more carbon in 3 months than the entire continent of Europe emits in a year. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody modelled it correctly. And then it happened again in 2015, except that time, 3 different continents failed simultaneously through 3 completely different mechanisms. Now, NOAA is forecasting a super El Niño for 2026 that could be stronger than both. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The forests it is about to hit are in worse shape than they have ever been entering one of these events. This is not a weather story. This is a story about the one system keeping this planet livable, and whether it survives what is coming. If this already has you asking questions, hit like and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because we are just getting started. The event has not even peaked yet, the forest data is still coming in, and the deeper this goes, the harder it becomes to look away. You will want to be here when the next piece lands. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The forecast that quietly crossed a threshold. There is a number sitting in a government database right now that almost nobody outside of a small circle of atmospheric scientists is talking about. And if you understood what it meant, really understood it, you would not be sleeping as well as you are tonight. The number is 2.75, 2 degrees and 75 hundredths of a degree Celsius. That is the upper end of the ensemble forecast for what oceanographers call the Niño 3.4 region, a stretch of the central Pacific Ocean that acts like the thermostat of the entire global climate system. And according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, there is a 61% probability that this region crosses the threshold of a super El Niño by July of 2026. Not a moderate event, not a strong event, a super event. The kind of anomaly that only 2 other times in the modern instrumental record have we ever clearly documented, 1997 to 1998 and 2015 to 2016. Every time something like this happens, the headlines write themselves. Floods in Peru, droughts across Indonesia and Australia, wildfire smoke choking cities across Southeast Asia, coral bleaching across the tropics. You have seen this story before, or at least a version of it, and so has most of the media ecosystem that covers climate and weather. The coverage is not wrong. Those things will happen. They are real, they are devastating, and they deserve every column inch they get. But here is what the headlines almost never say. Here is the story that is hiding underneath the story, invisible, slow-moving, and in some ways far more consequential than anything you will watch on the evening news. Every year, human civilization pumps roughly 37 to 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A gigaton is 1 billion metric tons. That number is almost impossible to visualize, so instead, think of it this way. Picture every car, every plane, every factory, every power station on Earth running simultaneously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That is the scale of what we are emitting. And yet, astonishingly, only about half of it stays in the atmosphere. The other half, roughly 18 to 20 gigatons per year, gets absorbed. Not by technology, not by carbon capture plants, by forests and oceans, by living systems, by biology. The tropical rainforests of the Amazon, Central Africa, and Southeast Asia are collectively the largest land-based carbon sink on Earth. They inhale carbon dioxide the way lungs inhale air, locking it away in wood, soil, and roots. The oceans do something similar through chemistry and microscopic life at the surface. Together, these systems form a kind of invisible infrastructure, an atmospheric backstop that has been quietly absorbing roughly half of everything we throw at the sky every single year for decades. Without it, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere would be rising roughly twice as fast as it already is. Without it, the climate projections that already worry you would look significantly worse. Now here is the thing about El Niño that the weather coverage never quite gets to. An El Niño event is not just a redistribution of heat. When that pool of warm water in the central Pacific shifts, it does not just change where it rains and where it dries out. It reaches into the biology of entire continents. It stresses the forests. It dries out the peat. It pushes ecosystems past the thresholds at which they absorb carbon and into the territory where they start releasing it. The most powerful El Niño events do not just affect weather, they temporarily shut off the planet's carbon sink. In 1997 to 1998, the Indonesian peat fires released an estimated 0.8 to 2.5 gigatons of carbon in a matter of months, in a single geographic region from a single triggering mechanism. In 2015 to 2016, the most comprehensively observed El Niño in history, the global carbon sink weakened so dramatically that atmospheric carbon dioxide grew at the fastest rate ever recorded at that point. 2.5 gigatons of excess carbon released in a year. Both times, the system eventually recovered. Both times, the forests and oceans came back online. The growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide dropped back toward its baseline trend, and the scientific community filed the event under significant but temporary. The question that almost nobody is asking out loud, the question that a handful of researchers are beginning to raise in papers and conference presentations and careful, guarded language, is whether that recovery will happen again in 2026. Not whether El Niño will be strong, not whether the droughts will be severe, but whether, after this particular event hits a system that has been accumulating damage for decades, the carbon sink comes back online at all. That is the real story. And to tell it properly, you need to understand why this year is different from every year that came before it. Why the baseline, the starting condition of the forests and the soils and the ecosystems that make up this invisible infrastructure, has shifted in ways that make recovery less certain than it has ever been. The floods will be covered, the droughts will be covered, but the thing that keeps the planet livable is the carbon system, and that system is about to face its most serious stress test in human history. So let us start at the beginning. Let us start with the forecast. Part, the metric almost nobody uses. Most people who follow climate news have heard of El Niño's strength measured in terms of temperature anomaly. The Oceanic Niño Index, the ONI, if you want the acronym, is the standard tool. It measures how much warmer or cooler the surface of the Niño 3.4 region is relative to a 30-year average baseline. Cross plus 0.5 degrees Celsius for 5 overlapping 3-month periods, you have an El Niño. Cross plus 1.5, you have a strong one. Cross plus 2.0, and you are in super El Niño territory. That is the metric the forecasters cite. That is the number making headlines. But there is a different metric that a smaller group of researchers has started paying more attention to, and it tells a subtly different and in some ways more troubling story. It is called the Relative Oceanic Niño Index, the RONI. And the difference between the ONI and the RONI is not just technical, it is conceptual, and it matters enormously for understanding what 2026 might actually mean. Here is the problem with the standard ONI. The baseline it measures against is a 30-year rolling average that gets updated every decade, which means the reference point for what counts as anomalously warm keeps shifting upward as the background ocean temperature rises due to climate change. The entire Pacific Ocean is warmer now than it was in the 1990s. It is warmer than it was in the 2000s. It is warmer than it was when the 1997 El Niño established the modern benchmark for super events. So when you say the 2026 event has a similar temperature anomaly to 1997, you are saying it is that much warmer than an already warmer baseline. The absolute temperature of the ocean surface, the thing that actually drives evaporation, atmospheric circulation, and ecosystem stress, could be higher in 2026, even if the relative anomaly looks comparable. The RONI attempts to correct for this by using a fixed, longer baseline rather than a sliding window. The result is that many recent El Niño events look stronger on the RONI than they do on the standard ONI, because the warming of the baseline is making the ONI systematically understate how hot things actually are in absolute terms. Why does this connect to the carbon sink story? Because the forests and the soils and the ecosystems that make up that invisible infrastructure do not respond to anomalies. They respond to absolute conditions, A tree in the Amazon does not know or care whether this drought is 2 degrees above the 30-year average or 3 degrees above the 20-year average. It knows how hot it is. It knows how dry the soil is. It knows whether it can photosynthesize or whether it has to shut down. And if the background temperature of the system keeps rising, then each successive El Niño arrives into a forest that is already more heat-stressed, more water-stressed, more primed for failure. Even if the relative anomaly looks familiar, there is a quiet controversy embedded in this that the mainstream climate conversation has not fully confronted. When we look at the ONI forecast for 2026 and compare it to 1997, we may be reassuring ourselves with a number that is subtly misleading. We may be looking at relative temperature and concluding the events are comparable, while the absolute temperature regime, the one the forest actually lives in, is meaningfully hotter. And if the baseline shifted, then every living system responding to that baseline has shifted too. Part B. The multi-basin configuration returning. The Pacific Ocean does not act alone. The climate system is not a single machine with one switch. It is a network of interconnected systems, and when multiple parts of that network align in the same direction at the same time, the result can be far more severe than any individual component would suggest. There is a configuration that climate historians have identified in the most disruptive climate events of the past 150 years, a particular alignment of ocean basins that, when it occurs simultaneously, amplifies drought stress across the tropical landmasses where most of the world's remaining rainforests grow. It requires 3 things happening at once: an El Niño in the Pacific, anomalously warm temperatures in the Atlantic, and something called a positive Indian Ocean dipole, where the western Indian Ocean runs warmer than the eastern side. The last time all 3 of these aligned clearly was 2015 to 2016. The time before that, you have to go back to the 1870s, to the period that climate historian Mike Davis documented as the trigger for the Great Victorian Famines, a multi-year, multi-continental disruption that killed somewhere between 30 and 60 million people across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, primarily through crop failure driven by coincident droughts on multiple continents. The 1877 to 1878 El Niño is considered one of the most destructive climate events in recorded history, not because of its absolute magnitude, but because of its configuration. Multiple basins, multiple continents, multiple systems failing at once. The early signals for 2026 suggest a configuration that is beginning to resemble that setup. The Atlantic is running warmer than average. There are preliminary indications of Indian Ocean warmth, and layered on top of this is something that was not a factor in 1877 and was only beginning to emerge as a scientific concern in 2015. The weakening of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC, the large-scale ocean conveyor belt that normally pumps heat away from the tropics and toward the North Atlantic. As that circulation weakens, heat that would normally be exported poleward stays bottled up in the tropical Atlantic, adding another layer of warmth to the system. What does this mean for the carbon story? It means the forests most critical to the global carbon sink, the Amazon, which responds primarily to Atlantic and Pacific conditions, and the forests of Indonesia, which respond to both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, are being stressed not from one direction, but from multiple directions simultaneously. The Amazon gets hit by El Niño drought from the Pacific and amplified drying from a warm Atlantic simultaneously. Indonesia gets squeezed by El Niño from one side and a positive Indian Ocean dipole from the other. When these systems align, the forest stress is not additive. It is multiplicative. This is not one system failing. This is multiple systems aligning against the same target. And that target, the carbon sink, is the one thing the planet depends on to stay even partially ahead of the emissions curve. The multi-basin configuration is not a footnote. It is one of the reasons that 2026 cannot be evaluated the same way you would evaluate a simple Pacific anomaly. Part Born. The real question nobody is asking. Here is an exercise worth trying. Go to any major news outlet and search for El Niño 2026. Read the first 10 articles. Count how many of them focus on the question of how strong the event will be, the peak temperature anomaly, the comparison to past super events, the probability of onset. Then count how many of them ask a different question. What happens afterward? The number will almost certainly be close to zero. And there is a reason for that. The severity of an El Niño event, its peak intensity, its associated floods and droughts and heat waves, is dramatic and visible, and it happens on a timescale that maps onto news cycles. Peruvian farmers losing crops, Indonesian villages surrounded by smoke, Australian reservoirs running dry. These are stories with faces and images and clear causal arrows pointing from the climate event to the human consequence. The carbon cycle does not work that way. The consequences of a carbon sink failure are distributed across decades, across geography, across generations. The excess carbon dioxide that enters the atmosphere during a major El Niño event does not cause a flood next Tuesday. It shifts the baseline of the climate system in ways that compound with everything else already happening, making every subsequent extreme event slightly more probable, every recovery slightly slower, every tipping threshold slightly closer. The consequences are real, profoundly real, but they are invisible on the timescale of a news cycle, which is probably why they have been almost entirely absent from the public conversation about 2026. This matters because the question of recovery is not just academically interesting, it is arguably the most important question in climate science right now. The reason the climate projections that scientists publish are not even more alarming than they already are is that those models assume the carbon sink continues to function, that forests and oceans continue absorbing roughly half of human emissions over the coming decades. The models build in some degradation of that sink over time because the science supports that expectation. But they do not, for the most part, build in a sudden near-term, partial collapse of that sink. They do not model a scenario in which the 2026 El Niño damages the tropical forest carbon sink to the point where recovery is incomplete or significantly delayed. And this is the thing about 1997 and 2015 that you need to hold in your mind as you process everything else in this story. Both times, the system came back. After 1997, the atmospheric carbon dioxide growth rate elevated for roughly a year and then came back down toward its trend line. After 2015 to 2016, something similar happened. The anomalous spike in growth rate faded, the forests in most regions regreened as the rains returned, and the models of the carbon cycle were updated to reflect what had happened. Both events were treated as serious but temporary disruptions, a stress test that the system absorbed and recovered from. The uncertainty hanging over 2026 is not about the stress test itself. It is about whether the system has accumulated enough background damage, enough deforestation, enough soil moisture deficit, enough warming, enough incremental degradation of its own structural integrity, that the recovery we have been counting on does not materialize with the same completeness, or perhaps does not materialize at all. A temporary shutdown of the carbon sink is a problem. A permanent one, or even a significantly prolonged one, is a different category of problem entirely. It is the difference between a bridge taking a load it was designed to handle and a bridge taking the same load after a decade of missing maintenance inspections. The load did not change. The bridge did. To understand why 2026 might be the first event that truly tests that distinction, you need to go back to the last 2 times the system failed, because those failures were not clean, and they left things behind. Part Num, 1997, the first carbon shock. Before 1997, the scientific community knew, in a theoretical sense, that El Niño events could disrupt the global carbon cycle. The reasoning was straightforward. El Niño causes drought in tropical regions. Drought stresses vegetation. Stressed vegetation absorbs less carbon dioxide, and therefore the atmospheric carbon dioxide level grows faster during El Niño years. This was understood. It was modeled, more or less, and it was considered a manageable perturbation, a temporary wobble in an otherwise stable and resilient system. Then the fires started in Borneo and Sumatra in late 1997, and the scientific community discovered something that no model had adequately prepared them for. Peat is not like ordinary soil. It is not like forest floor litter or rotting leaves or any of the normal organic material that cycles through the carbon system on timescales of years to decades. Peat is carbon that accumulated over thousands of years in conditions of permanent waterlogging, conditions where dead plant material could not decompose, where it simply compressed and compacted and accumulated, layer upon layer, in the waterlogged lowland forests of equatorial Asia. In the right places, the peat deposits of Borneo and Sumatra are 12 to 15 meters deep. Some of the carbon locked in those deposits has been there since the last ice age. It is not part of the contemporary carbon cycle. It is more like geological storage, ancient carbon that nature removed from the atmosphere over millennia. When the El Niño drought of 1997 dried out those peatlands, it did not just create conditions for surface fires. It created conditions for something far more alarming: underground fires. Peat, when it dries sufficiently, burns not just on the surface but below the surface, smouldering through the compressed organic layers in the way that a cigarette burns, slowly, persistently, and almost entirely immune to rainfall. A peat fire can continue underground through a monsoon season. It can continue for weeks or months after the visible surface fire has been extinguished, and it releases carbon that was not cycling at all before the fire, carbon that had been sequestered for centuries. The estimates of what actually burned in 1997 and 1998 vary significantly across different studies, which is itself a sign of how poorly understood the event was at the time. The most careful analyses place the total carbon release from Indonesian peat fires in that period at somewhere between 0.8 and 2.5 gigatons of carbon. That range of uncertainty is huge. It spans a factor of 3, but even the low end of the estimate is staggering. Global fossil fuel emissions at the time were running at roughly 6.5 to 7 gigatons of carbon per year. The Indonesian fires, in a few months, in a single archipelago, released the equivalent of somewhere between 12 and 38% of annual global fossil fuel emissions. In months, from fires burning not in forests but underground, in peat that had been accumulating since before recorded history. The haze that covered Southeast Asia in late 1997 and into 1998 was extraordinary. Malaysia, Singapore, and large parts of Indonesia were blanketed in smoke for months. Airports closed, schools closed, hospital admissions for respiratory illness spiked across multiple countries. The human health impact was severe and immediate and visible, but the carbon impact was something different: invisible, diffuse, distributed across the entire atmosphere. The Indonesian fires did not cause a local carbon problem. They caused a global one. The crucial thing to understand about 1997 is that it was not supposed to happen. The peat was not supposed to burn. The hydrological conditions that kept those peatlands waterlogged year-round were supposed to be robust enough to withstand even a severe El Niño drought. The carbon locked in those deposits was supposed to be, for all practical purposes, permanently sequestered. The event revealed a vulnerability in the global carbon system that nobody had quantitatively understood before it happened. And 1997, it turned out, was just the first demonstration. Part Sao, 2015, the system fails in 3 different ways. In the years between 1997 and 2015, something remarkable happened in climate science. The tools got genuinely, dramatically better. The launch of the Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2, OCO2, in 2014 gave researchers the first satellite capable of mapping atmospheric carbon dioxide with enough precision and resolution to actually see where it was coming from and going at a regional level. When the 2015 to 2016 El Niño arrived, it arrived into the best observed climate system in history. Scientists could watch the carbon cycle respond in near real time, in a way that was simply impossible during 1997. What they saw surprised them. The headline finding from OCO2 observations of the 2015 to 2016 event, published in the journal Science in 2017, was that the global land carbon sink weakened by approximately 2.5 gigatons of carbon relative to its expected value during that year. The atmospheric growth rate of carbon dioxide hit 3.05 parts per million in 2016, the largest annual increase ever recorded at that point. That record has since been approached or matched, but in 2016, it was a genuine shock to the scientific community. But the more interesting finding was not the total number. It was the geographic breakdown of how the failure happened. In Indonesia and broader Southeast Asia, the story was the same as 1997, peat fires triggered by El Niño drought, releasing ancient carbon from the same compressed peatland deposits that had burned nearly 2 decades earlier. This was at least understandable. It was the mechanism that 1997 had revealed, and it was operating again on roughly the same territory. In the Amazon, something different was happening. The drought of 2015 and 2016 reduced photosynthesis across large areas of the Amazon basin, meaning the forests were taking up less carbon than normal, not because they were burning, but because drought stress was forcing the trees to close their stomata, reducing gas exchange, and slowing the fundamental biological process that drives carbon absorption. The Amazon, in a bad drought year, does not just stop growing, it starts to reverse. Living trees continue to respire, to release carbon dioxide as a metabolic byproduct. But if drought cuts off photosynthesis, the net balance tips from absorption to emission. The forest does not have to burn to become a carbon source. It just has to stop functioning normally. And then there was tropical Africa. This was the genuinely unexpected finding. The OCO2 data showed a large positive carbon anomaly across Central and Eastern Africa, not driven primarily by fire, not primarily by drought-reducing photosynthesis, but by increased ecosystem respiration in warm soils. Higher temperatures increase the rate at which soil microbes decompose organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. The entire African tropical ecosystem, responding to elevated temperatures during the El Niño period, essentially sped up its metabolic rate, exhaling more carbon dioxide even without any dramatic visible disruption. 3 different continents, 3 completely different mechanisms: fire in Indonesia, photosynthesis shutdown in the Amazon, soil respiration acceleration in Africa, all happening simultaneously, all driven by the same El Niño event operating through completely different pathways. The system did not fail in one way, it failed in multiple independent ways at once. Before 2015, climate models had been built largely around the expectation that fire was the primary mechanism through which El Niño would damage the global carbon sink. The Indonesian fires of 1997 supported that expectation. But 2015 revealed that fire is not even necessarily the dominant mechanism. You can lose the carbon sink without a single visible fire. Through the physiology of trees under drought stress and the biochemistry of warming soils, the system has multiple pathways to failure, not one. And when a strong enough event hits a warm enough baseline, multiple pathways can fail simultaneously. Part B. The carbon sink did not fully recover. Here is something that the standard narrative about 1997 and 2015 gets slightly wrong, or at least incomplete. The narrative goes, El Niño hits, carbon sink weakens dramatically, atmospheric carbon dioxide spikes, El Niño ends, carbon sink recovers, growth rate comes back down, crisis averted, lesson learned, carry on. And this narrative is not false, exactly. The growth rate did come back down after both events. The forests did regreen as the rains returned. The satellite data did show recovery. But look more carefully at the numbers, and a different and more troubling picture begins to emerge. If you plot the year-over-year growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide at the Mauna Loa Observatory, the gold standard of atmospheric carbon measurements, running continuously since 1958, you see clear spikes in 1998 and in 2016 corresponding to those 2 super El Niño events. After the 1998 spike, the growth rate drops back down. After the 2016 spike, same thing. Recovery, apparently. But the underlying trend line, the baseline growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide in non-El Niño years, has been rising through the 1990s, through the 2000s, through the 2010s. The growth rate in a normal year is higher now than it was in the late 1990s. Part of this is simply the increase in human fossil fuel emissions over that period. But separating the human emissions signal from the biosphere signal is genuinely difficult, and some researchers have argued that the rising baseline growth rate is not entirely explained by rising emissions. There may be a biosphere component, a slow, incremental weakening of the carbon sink that is not being fully offset by ecosystem recovery after each disturbance event. This is what some scientists call the ratchet effect. Each El Niño event stresses the forests. The forests recover, but perhaps not entirely. They come back slightly weaker, slightly less resilient, slightly more prone to failure at the next disturbance. The growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide spikes during the event drops afterward, but perhaps not quite as far back down as it was before. The baseline ratchets upward, increment by increment, and each subsequent super event arrives into a system that has fractionally less reserve capacity than the one before. The Hubao 2020 study, published in the journal Nature, provided striking evidence for at least part of this story in the Amazon. Analyzing decades of data from more than 300 permanent monitoring plots across the Amazon basin, the study found that the net carbon uptake of the Amazon had been declining since the 1990s, not because trees were dying, but because the growth rate of surviving trees was slowing, apparently in response to increasing temperature stress, while mortality was increasing from drought and wind. The Amazon was not yet a net carbon source overall in that study's dataset, but it was trending in that direction. Its reserve capacity, its ability to absorb carbon above and beyond its own metabolic needs, was shrinking. This is the finding that gives the 2026 forecast a different quality of concern than either 1997 or 2015. The system may not be returning to the same baseline after each event. Each event may be leaving behind a slightly smaller buffer, a slightly more vulnerable system, a slightly reduced capacity to absorb the next shock. And if that is true, then the question of recovery after 2026 cannot be answered simply by looking at what happened after 1997 and 2015. Because the system those events were recovering from was not the same as the system 2026 is about to encounter. Part Tom. The hidden pattern. Each event leaves damage behind. There is a pattern in the timing of these events that becomes more apparent the longer you look at it, and it is not a comforting one. The 1997 to 1998 Super El Niño was followed by roughly 18 years before the next super event, in 2015 to 2016. 18 years. That is not a long time by the standards of forest ecology, but it is a meaningful period, long enough for most of the directly fire-damaged areas in Indonesia and the Amazon to undergo significant regrowth, for soil moisture deficits to be replenished by multiple wet seasons, for the slow work of forest recovery to make meaningful progress. The system, in other words, had an 18-year window to rebuild before it was hit again. The 2015 to 2016 event is expected to be followed by the 2026 Super El Niño. That is a gap of roughly 11 years. 11 years for Indonesian peatlands, many of which burned twice, in 1997 and again in 2015, to recover. 11 years for drought-stressed trees in the Amazon to rebuild their water reserves and restore normal photosynthetic function. 11 years for the soils across tropical Africa to cool and stabilize. And, critically, 11 years during which none of these systems were operating in a static, stable environment. They were being subjected to ongoing background warming, ongoing deforestation pressure in the Amazon and Indonesia, and the increased frequency of non-El Niño droughts that warming climate conditions are already producing. The concept here is recovery time versus disturbance frequency. Ecosystems have characteristic timescales over which they can recover from severe disturbance. A tropical forest that has been subjected to a major drought stress event needs time, not just months, but potentially years to decades, to fully restore its carbon sink function. The soil carbon that burned in Indonesia in 1997 has not been replaced. It took thousands of years to accumulate. It will take thousands of years to accumulate again if the conditions for peat formation ever return. The recovery of the structural carbon sink, the intact peat, the old-growth forest, is simply not happening on the timescale between these events. What researchers like Wenju Kai have shown through modeling studies is that the frequency of super El Niño events is likely to increase as global temperatures rise. The atmospheric conditions that favor the development of super El Niños, a warmer Pacific, a more energetic tropics, are exactly the conditions that climate change is producing. The implication is not just that the events are getting stronger, it is that they are getting closer together. The recovery windows are shrinking. There is a concept in ecology called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, the idea that moderate, regular disturbances can actually increase ecosystem diversity and resilience by preventing any single species or process from dominating. But at high disturbance intensity and high disturbance frequency, the opposite effect takes over. The system does not have time to adapt and diversify. It degrades. The stress accumulates faster than the recovery. You can think of it as the difference between exercise and injury. Moderate stress followed by adequate recovery makes a system stronger. Too much stress too frequently, without enough recovery time, breaks it down. The tropical carbon sink has been exercised hard twice in the last 30 years. It is about to be exercised again, harder, with less recovery time, on a warmer baseline, in a system with measurably degraded structural integrity in its most critical regions. 2026 is the first test where the recovery window may genuinely have run out. Part Chin. The Amazon has already partially flipped. In 2021, a group of Brazilian and international researchers published a paper in the journal Nature that quietly changed the framing of the entire Amazon carbon debate. The lead author was Luciana Gatti, and the method was deceptively simple. They flew aircraft over 4 regions of the Amazon and measured the carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide concentrations in the atmosphere above the forest. By comparing incoming air to outgoing air, they could calculate whether each region was absorbing or releasing carbon dioxide. It was, in effect, breathing the forest and seeing whether it was inhaling or exhaling. What they found in the southeastern Amazon was unambiguous and alarming. That region, roughly 1/4 of the entire Amazon basin, a forested area comparable in size to Western Europe, was already, in the years of the study, a net carbon source. Not during El Niño, not during drought years. In normal years, the southeastern Amazon had already crossed the line from carbon sink to carbon emitter on a permanent basis, even without a super El Niño pushing it over. The mechanism driving this is not primarily fire, though fire plays a role. It is deforestation-driven changes to the water cycle. The Amazon rainforest, through the process of evapotranspiration, trees drawing water from the soil and releasing it through their leaves into the atmosphere, effectively generates its own rainfall. The forest creates the moisture that feeds the forest. Remove enough trees and you break this cycle. Rainfall decreases, the remaining forest gets drier, drought stress increases. Trees that were absorbing carbon dioxide begin to just barely keep up with their own respiration needs, and then fall behind. The forest begins to exhale more than it inhales, and because less forest means less moisture recycled into the atmosphere, the drought deepens and the process accelerates. The southeastern Amazon appears to have crossed a local threshold beyond which this self-reinforcing mechanism is already operating. Researchers Thomas Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre have been making this argument for years that the Amazon has a tipping point somewhere around 20 to 25% total deforestation, at which the moisture recycling system breaks down sufficiently to initiate a self-sustaining transition toward a drier, more open, savanna-like ecosystem. The current deforestation level in the Amazon is somewhere around 17 to 20% of the original extent, depending on how you measure and which satellite data you use. The southeastern Amazon, which has been more heavily deforested than other regions and has also experienced more intense drought stress, appears to be a local leading indicator of where the system as a whole may be heading. When 2026 arrives, it will not be arriving into an intact Amazon forest that is uniformly functioning as a carbon sink. It will be arriving into a system where one quadrant, one of 4 roughly equal regions of the largest rainforest on Earth, is already in normal conditions, releasing more carbon than it absorbs. El Niño will not be the thing that flips that region. It is already flipped. El Niño will determine whether the remaining 3 quadrants can hold, or whether the drought stress expands the already flipped region and tips additional areas across the same threshold. That is a fundamentally different risk profile than anything that existed in 1997 or 2015. In both of those events, the Amazon was being stressed from a functional baseline. The deforestation had not yet accumulated to the point of regional sink failure. This time, the event begins with part of the system already in failure mode. Part Mui. Indonesia. The peat time bomb is worse now. When the 1997 fires swept through the peatlands of Borneo and Sumatra, the international scientific community was shocked. It was not on the maps. The peatlands had been largely invisible in the global carbon accounting, their enormous carbon stocks underappreciated, their vulnerability to drought and fire entirely unforeseen at the scale that materialized. After 1997, and again after 2015 when the fires returned, there were significant international efforts to improve the situation. Indonesia established a peat restoration agency. International funding flowed toward re-wetting projects, where drainage canals cut into the peatlands for palm oil and pulpwood plantations were supposed to be blocked, raising the water table back to levels where fire ignition would be suppressed. Satellite monitoring improved, fire detection and suppression capabilities were enhanced. The results have been mixed, and in the most important structural sense, the situation is worse today than it was in 1997. Here is why. The fundamental problem is not the fires themselves, it is the drainage. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, massive areas of lowland peat forest in Borneo and Sumatra were drained for conversion to palm oil plantations and pulpwood plantations. Drainage canals lowered the water table in the peat, which dried out the upper layers and made them combustible. The fires are a consequence of the drainage. Without drainage, the peat is saturated and does not burn. With drainage, a dry season, even a normal dry season, creates fire risk. An El Niño dry season creates catastrophe. Despite the restoration efforts, the vast majority of the drainage network that was cut into these peatlands over the past 4 decades remains in place. The re-wetting projects have affected a relatively small fraction of the total drained area. The structural hydrological damage, the lowered water tables, the dried out carbon layers, the broken connection between the peat and the groundwater systems that historically kept it saturated, has not been repaired at anything approaching the scale of the problem. And this matters critically, because the areas that burned in 1997 and 2015 burned after their water tables had already been lowered by drainage. The re-wetting that has occurred in the intervening years has been insufficient to restore pre-drainage conditions in most areas. Layered on top of this structural damage is the fact that the peat surface itself is now lower than it was. When peat burns, it is consumed, the carbon is gone, the land surface subsides. In some areas of Borneo and Sumatra, the land has subsided by meters relative to where it was before the era of drainage and fire. Lower land means even greater difficulty in maintaining the water table, because the relationship between groundwater level and land surface has changed. Areas that could theoretically be re-wetted to saturation in 1997 can no longer be re-wetted to the same relative depth because the land surface has dropped, while the drainage infrastructure remains. The 2026 event will arrive into an Indonesian peatland landscape that has been burned twice, drained for decades, only partially re-wetted, and is sitting on a warmer baseline with a regional climate that is itself shifting toward more intense dry seasons. The ignition potential is not lower than it was in 1997, it is measurably higher. And the carbon that could be released, the peat that has been exposed by decades of drainage and is now dry enough to burn, represents an enormous quantity of ancient carbon that no one is adequately accounting for in near-term climate projections. Part 11. The Congo, the unknown variable. Barely anyone was talking about the Congo Basin forests in 1997. Scientists knew they existed. They knew they were large. But the data infrastructure necessary to understand what was happening to the carbon cycle in Central Africa was essentially absent. No comprehensive aircraft sampling programs, no dense network of atmospheric monitoring stations, no satellite tools capable of attributing regional carbon fluxes with confidence. Then in 2017, a remarkable discovery was published in the journal Nature. A team led by Simon Lewis and Greta Dargi from University College London announced that they had located and measured the world's largest tropical peatland, not in Indonesia, but in the Congo Basin, covering an area of roughly 145,000 square kilometers, comparable in size to the entire country of England. This peatland had gone essentially unmapped and unmeasured in all previous carbon accounting. The carbon stored in the Congo peatlands was estimated at approximately 30 billion tons of carbon. To put that in context, that is equivalent to roughly 3 years of all current global fossil fuel emissions stored in a swamp. The Congo Basin peatlands are currently intact. They are waterlogged. They are not burning. The hydrological conditions that keep them saturated have not been significantly disrupted by agriculture or drainage the way the Southeast Asian peatlands have. In that sense, they are not currently a source of the same kind of acute fire risk that Indonesia represents, but they are vulnerable to temperature increase, and the OCO2 satellite data from the 2015 to 2016 El Niño event showed that the African tropical forest region, including Central Africa, produced a large, positive carbon anomaly through the mechanism of increased soil respiration in warming conditions. Not fire, not drought-driven photosynthesis shutdown, just warmer soils making soil microbes work faster, releasing carbon dioxide from the decomposition of organic matter at an accelerated rate. The Congo peatlands represent a potential blind spot in the global carbon accounting of 2026 that the scientific community does not have the monitoring infrastructure to adequately characterize. They could behave quietly. They could contribute a large soil respiration signal if temperatures spike sufficiently. Nobody has enough data to say with confidence which of those scenarios is more likely, and that uncertainty is itself part of the risk calculation. Part 12. Soil moisture debt from 2023 to 2024. 2023 and 2024 were extraordinary years by almost any climate metric. The global mean surface temperature in 2023 broke previous records by a margin that surprised even the scientists who study these trends. And in the Amazon, the consequences were severe and lasting in ways that have not received adequate attention in the framing of the 2026 El Niño story. In 2023, the Amazon experienced its worst drought in recorded history. River levels fell to historic lows. The Rio Negro near Manaus, one of the major tributaries of the Amazon, dropped to levels not seen since records began. Dozens of river dolphins were found dead in lakes that were evaporating. Indigenous communities and riverside towns were cut off from supply routes. The scale of the human impact was enormous. But for the carbon story, the most consequential thing about the 2023 drought was what it did to the soil. Soil moisture is not just a measure of how wet the ground is. It is a kind of ecological memory. The trees of the Amazon draw on soil moisture reserves during the dry season, using water stored from the last rainy season to maintain photosynthesis and growth. Deep-rooted trees can access water stored several meters below the surface, reserves that build up over multiple wet seasons and are drawn down slowly over multiple dry seasons. When a drought is severe enough, it does not just draw down the shallow soil moisture, It draws down the deep reserves, the water stored across multiple previous years that provides the buffer against climate variability. When that deep soil moisture reserve is depleted, it does not recover in one wet season. It may take multiple consecutive above-average wet seasons to fully rebuild, and if another drought follows before the deep reserves are rebuilt, which is exactly what is being forecast for 2026, the trees face a compounded deficit. They enter the new drought already below their normal starting moisture level, which means they reach the threshold of severe drought stress earlier, stay there longer, and accumulate more damage. The 2023 drought also killed trees. Not in the dramatic manner of a fire, but quietly, trees weakened by moisture stress became susceptible to bark beetle infestation, to fungal infection, to wind damage. Large areas of forest experienced measurable excess mortality that would not show up in fire data, but would show up in carbon accounting as increased deadwood decomposition, increased soil carbon release, and reduced standing biomass. These dead and dying trees represent a legacy of the 2023 event that will still be decomposing in 2026, adding a background carbon release to whatever the El Niño event itself drives. The system entering 2026 is not starting from a rested, hydrated, fully functional baseline. It is starting from a system still working through the after effects of the worst drought in its recorded history. It is entering a new stress event already partially depleted, already carrying damage from the last one, the way an athlete tries to compete the week after an injury before the body has fully healed. The performance is compromised before the starting gun fires, and the strain of what is coming could expose vulnerabilities that would not have mattered if the system had been given the time it needed to recover. Part MUBA, Carbon Cycle Feedback Loop Acceleration. There is a concept in complex systems science that is easy to say but difficult to fully internalize until you see it operating in the real world: the positive feedback loop. Not positive in the sense of good, positive in the technical sense of amplifying, of self-reinforcing. A change in one part of the system produces a change in another part, which feeds back to amplify the original change, which produces more change, which amplifies further. The loop runs itself. The carbon cycle has several potential positive feedback loops embedded in it, and the terrifying thing about 2026 is that it could activate more than one of them simultaneously. Here is the basic architecture of the one that matters most for this story. Higher atmospheric carbon dioxide and increasing greenhouse gas concentrations warm the climate. Warming increases drought stress across tropical regions. Drought-stressed tropical forests absorb less carbon dioxide and, when conditions are severe enough, release more. The carbon released adds to atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, which causes more warming, which increases drought stress, which reduces carbon uptake further. The loop feeds itself. Under normal conditions, the conditions that have prevailed for most of human history, this loop does not run away. The carbon sink is strong enough, the forest is resilient enough, and the climate perturbations are temporary enough that the loop damps rather than amplifies. The system finds its way back to equilibrium. The feedback is real, but it is controlled by the buffering capacity of the ecosystem. What changes when the baseline degrades is the buffering capacity. The feedback does not need a catastrophically large initial trigger if the buffering capacity is already reduced. A smaller perturbation can generate a larger response if the system's ability to absorb and dampen disturbances has been undermined. And everything we have been discussing, the already flipped southeastern Amazon, the structurally damaged Indonesian peatlands, the soil moisture deficit from 2023 to 2024, the compounding background warming from climate change, all of these factors reduce the buffering capacity of the system that is about to be subjected to an El Niño of super event magnitude. The non-linearity of this system is what makes it genuinely alarming. Systems with positive feedback loops do not degrade linearly. They can appear stable for a long time and then tip relatively quickly into a different regime. The transition is not gradual. It is a threshold followed by a rapid shift. And the difficulty with threshold systems is that you often cannot tell from the outside how close to the threshold you are until you have crossed it. The system looks fine, looks fine, looks fine, and then it does not. Climate models have historically had difficulty capturing this nonlinearity, partly because the relevant processes span multiple disciplines: atmospheric physics, forest ecology, soil biogeochemistry, hydrology, and integrating all of them into a single coupled model at sufficient resolution is computationally demanding and scientifically incomplete. The models that inform the IPCC assessment reports are good and improving, but they are generally calibrated to past behavior of the system, and if the system is about to enter a regime that has no historical analog in the instrumental record, the model's ability to predict it is limited by definition. The best they can do, the best the science can do right now, is identify the mechanisms, quantify the individual components, estimate the probability distributions of different outcomes, and flag the scenarios that warrant the most concern. And 2026 is flagging a significant number of those mechanisms simultaneously. Part Muborn. Ocean uptake weakening. The tropical forests are not the only thing standing between human emissions and the full accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The oceans absorb approximately 10 gigatons of carbon per year, roughly the same amount as all the world's forests combined. And El Niño affects ocean carbon uptake too, through a mechanism that is different from the forest story but points in the same direction. Under normal La Niña or neutral conditions in the tropical Pacific, cold, carbon-rich water from the deep ocean is upwelled to the surface along the equator, particularly in the eastern Pacific, near the coast of South America. This cold water, exposed to the atmosphere, absorbs heat and also absorbs carbon dioxide, but it also outgasses some of the carbon dioxide it carries from depth, making the equatorial Pacific one of the few regions of the ocean that is a net source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in normal conditions. During an El Niño event, the warm pool of surface water in the central and western Pacific expands eastward, suppressing the cold water upwelling. Less cold water means less outgassing from the deep ocean in the equatorial Pacific, which sounds like it should be good for the carbon balance. And in that specific region, it is. The equatorial Pacific actually becomes a weak carbon sink during El Niño, but the broader ocean picture is more complicated. Warmer ocean surface temperatures, as the entire tropical Pacific heats up during a super El Niño, reduce the solubility of carbon dioxide in surface water. Warmer water simply holds less dissolved gas. This reduces the rate at which the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere across large areas. The net effect of El Niño on ocean carbon uptake is contested in the literature, but several studies have found that the land sink weakening during major El Niño events is the dominant signal, while the ocean effect is smaller and partially offsetting. However, the concern for 2026 is that the background warming of the ocean surface, now at its highest levels in the observational record, has already been reducing ocean carbon solubility at a baseline level that has nothing to do with El Niño specifically. If the forest sink weakens during 2026, the ocean sink cannot be assumed to compensate. The ocean is not a static backup system with unlimited reserve capacity. It too is warming, acidifying, and showing signs of reduced uptake efficiency. Losing both buffers simultaneously, even partially, is the scenario that sends climate projections into genuinely uncharted territory, because those projections assume at least one of the two major natural sinks continues to function at or near historical levels. Part Muilam, agricultural fragility layer. The carbon sink failure story is not isolated from the rest of the human systems that depend on the same climate infrastructure. It runs through the food system, through the agricultural supply chains that feed billions of people, through the same drought and heat stress mechanisms that stress the forests. And the exposure of the food system to those mechanisms in 2026 adds a layer of instability to the overall picture that deserves considerably more attention than it is currently receiving. Start with geography. Because the geography here is not a coincidence, it is the mechanism. The drought footprint of a super El Niño is not random. It follows predictable patterns driven by the same atmospheric circulation changes that stress the tropical forests. And when you overlay that footprint onto a map of global agricultural production, the overlap is striking enough to make you stop and look at it twice. The Mekong Delta, the river system that drains parts of China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam before spreading across the lowlands of southern Vietnam into the South China Sea, is one of the most productive rice-growing regions on Earth. It feeds a significant fraction of Southeast Asia. During El Niño years, the monsoon rains that replenish the Mekong's flow are suppressed. River levels drop. Saltwater intrusion from the sea pushes further inland into the delta's irrigation channels. Rice yields fall. In 2015 to 2016, Vietnamese farmers in the delta experienced the worst drought in nearly a century, and rice output dropped sharply across the region. Moved to northern Australia, which produces substantial quantities of wheat and other grains, much of it for export. El Niño systematically dries northern and eastern Australia, reducing rainfall during the critical growing periods. The 1997 to 1998 event was associated with severe drought across large parts of eastern Australia. 2015 to 2016 was similarly damaging. The Australian wheat harvest in El Niño years can fall by 20 to 40% in affected regions, which ripples through global export markets because Australia is one of the world's major wheat exporters. Move to southern Africa. From Zimbabwe south through Zambia into Mozambique and across parts of South Africa, maize is the dietary foundation for hundreds of millions of people. It is not a commodity crop in the way wheat is in Australia. It is what people eat directly every day. El Niño suppresses the rainfall that the southern African summer growing season depends on. In severe events, multiple consecutive seasons of below-average rainfall can follow. The 1991 to 1992 El Niño produced a southern African drought that brought famine conditions to Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique simultaneously. The 2015 to 2016 event caused significant crop failures across the same region, triggering emergency food assistance declarations in multiple countries at the same time. Move to India. The Indian summer monsoon, the seasonal rainfall system that waters more than half of India's agricultural land, is sensitive to El Niño in ways that have been documented for over a century. A strong El Niño weakens the monsoon by disrupting the temperature gradient between the Indian Ocean and the Asian landmass that drives monsoon circulation. In El Niño years, monsoon onset is often delayed, rainfall is below average, and the shortfall falls disproportionately on rain-fed agriculture, the kind practiced by small farmers who do not have access to irrigation. India's wheat and rice belts are partially protected by irrigation infrastructure, but partial protection is not immunity. In a super El Niño year, the stress is large enough to push past the buffer that irrigation provides in the most severely affected regions. And then there is northeastern Brazil, the semi-arid region known as the Sertão, where El Niño suppresses the seasonal rains that small-scale subsistence and semi-commercial farmers depend on entirely. The Sertão has a history of catastrophic droughts in El Niño, years going back centuries. The 1877 El Niño produced a drought there that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. Modern Brazil has vastly better infrastructure and social safety nets than 1877, but the region remains one of the most climate-vulnerable agricultural zones in the Americas, and a super El Niño is the specific trigger that historically produces its worst outcomes. Now, here is where the story becomes something more than a collection of regional agricultural risks. The reason simultaneous multi-regional crop stress in 2026 is a different kind of problem than any single regional failure is the architecture of the global food system itself. Modern agricultural supply chains are globally integrated in a way that provides remarkable efficiency under normal conditions and remarkable fragility under abnormal ones. When Brazil has a bad maize year, global maize markets adjust. When Australia has a bad wheat year, global wheat markets adjust. When India has a monsoon shortfall, global rice markets adjust. Any one of these adjustments, in isolation, is manageable. The system has enough reserve capacity, enough geographic diversity of supply that single region failures get absorbed. What the system does not absorb easily is simultaneous failures across multiple major producing regions at the same time. That is the scenario that a super El Niño creates, not because every region fails catastrophically, but because multiple regions underperform simultaneously, draining the reserve capacity of the global food system from multiple directions at once. Global grain stocks, which are the buffer that smooths out year-to-year production variability, get drawn down faster than they can be replenished. Prices rise. Import-dependent countries, many of which are among the world's poorest, face food security stress not because their local harvest failed, but because the global price of what they need to buy has increased beyond what their populations can afford. Layered on top of this is a fragility that is specific to industrial agriculture and that makes 2026 structurally different from the 1973 to 1974 food crisis. Even though the basic mechanics are similar, modern high-yield agriculture runs on nitrogen fertilizer. The Haber-Bosch process, the industrial chemistry that converts atmospheric nitrogen into the ammonia that becomes fertilizer, is responsible for feeding roughly half the current global population. Without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, the world's agricultural land simply cannot produce enough food for 8 billion people at current dietary standards. And the Haber-Bosch process runs on natural gas. It is energy-intensive, feedstock-intensive, and sensitive to the price and availability of natural gas in ways that create a direct link between the energy market and the food market. In years when crop stress is high, exactly the years when farmers most need to maximize yields through heavy fertilizer application, the demand for nitrogen fertilizer peaks, and if natural gas prices are elevated due to geopolitical factors, infrastructure constraints, or competing demand from heating and electricity generation, the cost of fertilizer rises at exactly the moment when farmers can least afford it and need it most. This is not a theoretical vulnerability. It played out in 2021 and 2022, when natural gas price spikes following the disruption of European energy markets drove fertilizer prices to levels that caused farmers in multiple developing countries to reduce application rates, contributing to yield shortfalls that were felt across multiple growing seasons. In 2026, if the El Niño arrives as forecast, the demand signal for fertilizer inputs across multiple stressed regions will peak simultaneously. The geopolitical environment surrounding energy markets is not more stable than it was in 2021. The agricultural supply chains serving the regions most exposed to El Niño drought are not more resilient than they were. And the global population that depends on those supply chains is larger. The 1973 to 1974 crisis that rattled governments and produced the first modern global food security emergency combined climate stress, oil shock, and simultaneous multi-regional shortfalls in a world of 4 billion people. The underlying mechanics in 2026, climate stress plus energy market constraints plus simultaneous multi-regional crop pressure, are structurally identical. The world now has 8 billion people. The supply chains are more integrated, which means more efficient under normal conditions and more fragile under simultaneous stress. This agricultural layer does not change the carbon sink story. It does not make the forest failure more or less likely, but it operates through the same underlying climate stress, driven by the same El Niño forcing, affecting populations that are already the most exposed to the consequences of a warming world. They are branches of the same tree, and in 2026, that tree is about to face a storm of a magnitude it has not seen in a very long time, on ground that is already less stable than it looks. Part Muisao, the 1877 without warning scenario. There is a year that climatologists sometimes discuss quietly, not in press releases, not in the summary paragraphs of IPCC reports, But in conference hallways and in the introductory framing of papers about compound climate risk, when they are trying to define the outer boundary of what simultaneous system failures can actually produce, that year is 1877, and the reason they discuss it quietly is not because the science is uncertain. It is because the scale of what happened is difficult to communicate without sounding like you are being deliberately alarming. You are not. You are just reading the historical record. The El Niño event of 1877 to 1878 was, by the limited instrumental records available from that period, one of the strongest of the 19th century. The sea surface temperature anomalies reconstructed from historical proxy data, coral records, tree rings, documentary sources suggest an event comparable in magnitude to 1997, but the 1877 El Niño did not arrive alone. It arrived in the context of a warm Atlantic and what paleoclimatological reconstructions suggest may have been a positive Indian Ocean dipole configuration, the same multi-basin alignment we have been discussing as a feature of the 2026 setup. Multiple ocean basins, multiple atmospheric circulation systems, all pushing in the same direction at the same time. The result was coincident droughts across 4 continents simultaneously. India experienced one of the worst monsoon failures in its recorded history. The drought of 1876 to 1878 killed crops across the Deccan Plateau, across Madras, across Bombay, across large parts of what is now Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. China experienced catastrophic drought across the northern provinces, Shanxi, Henan, regions that were already under population pressure and had limited grain reserves. Brazil's Sertão, the semi-arid northeastern interior, experienced the Grande Seca, the Great Drought, that contemporary accounts describe as the worst in living memory, destroying harvests across multiple consecutive growing seasons and across large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The same atmospheric conditions suppressed rainfall in regions that had no infrastructure for coping with multi-year agricultural failure. The death toll from what became known as the Great Victorian Famines, the aggregated mortality from the famines in India, China, Brazil, and Africa between approximately 1876 and 1879, with trailing effects into the early 1880s, is estimated at somewhere between 30 and 60 million people. That range of uncertainty is itself a statement about how difficult it is to count the dead when they are dispersed across 4 continents, dying not from a single dramatic event, but from the slow accumulation of hunger, disease, displacement, and the collapse of whatever social structures normally provide protection against subsistence failure. The historian Mike Davis wrote the definitive account of these events in his 2001 book, Late Victorian Holocausts, and his argument is important enough to engage with seriously rather than gloss over. Davis's thesis is that the famines were not simply acts of nature, they were the product of a specific intersection between a climate shock and a political economy, the colonial system, that was structured in ways that actively prevented the normal social responses to famine from operating. Grain was exported from famine-affected regions in India even as people starved, because colonial economic policy prioritized market function over food security. Relief was withheld or delayed or administered in ways designed to minimize cost and maximize labor discipline. The railways that colonial infrastructure had built, which could theoretically have moved food to the affected populations, were used instead to move grain toward ports for export. Davis's argument is not that climate was irrelevant, it is that the climate event was the trigger that exposed the structural vulnerabilities of a political and economic system that had no genuine interest in the survival of the people it governed. The El Niño provided the stress. The colonial system removed the resilience. Together, they produced a death toll that reshaped the demographic landscape of multiple continents. Why does this matter for 2026? Not because we are about to repeat the Victorian famines. The modern world has genuinely different capabilities that make a direct analogue not just unlikely, but essentially impossible in the specific Victorian form. The World Food Programme exists. The Food and Agriculture Organization exists. Global grain reserves, while not unlimited, are orders of magnitude larger and more accessible than anything that existed in 1877. Early warning systems for drought and crop failure are now sophisticated enough that food security crises can be anticipated months in advance, rather than recognized only after mass mortality has already begun. The international humanitarian response architecture, whatever its limitations, is a real and functional system that did not exist in any form in the 1870s. These are not trivial differences, they are genuinely significant, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging them clearly, rather than constructing a Victorian famines analogy purely for rhetorical effect. But here is the version of the question that Davis's work actually raises for 2026, and it is a version that deserves more serious treatment than it typically receives in mainstream climate communication. The question is not whether we will experience Victorian-scale famine mortality. The question is whether the structure of the modern global system, its interdependencies, its integration, its optimization for efficiency over redundancy, creates new categories of fragility that did not exist in 1877, even as it eliminates the specific fragilities of the colonial period. The Victorian world was fragile in the way that isolated, undercapitalized, poorly connected systems are fragile. Each region was largely on its own. When India's harvest failed, there was limited capacity to import food from unaffected regions quickly enough to prevent famine, because the logistics did not exist at scale, because the political will to prioritize food security over export revenue was absent, and because the financial systems necessary to fund emergency food redistribution across continents were not designed for that purpose. The modern world is fragile in a completely different way. It is fragile in the way that tightly coupled, highly optimized, deeply interdependent systems are fragile. A disruption in one part of the system does not stay local, it propagates. When a major crop failure in one region drives up global commodity prices, it does not just affect that region, it affects every import-dependent country simultaneously. When fertilizer supply chains are disrupted by an energy market shock, it does not affect one country's agriculture, it affects the input costs of farming on multiple continents within a single growing season. When shipping bottlenecks develop in response to simultaneous multi-regional demand spikes, the countries least able to outbid their competitors for scarce cargo capacity are precisely the ones most dependent on imports for food security. The 1973 to 1974 period is instructive here. The combination of an El Niño event, the Soviet grain purchase that drained American reserves, and the oil embargo that spiked fertilizer prices produced a global food price crisis that the United States Secretary of Agriculture at the time described as the most serious food situation since World War II. And 1973 was a moderate El Niño. Not a super event, not a multi-basin configuration, not an event arriving on a degraded forest baseline or a stressed agricultural system carrying soil moisture deficits from the previous year. A moderate event, combined with coincident supply chain and energy market stress, was sufficient to produce a global food security emergency in a world of 4 billion people. The world in 2026 has 8 billion people. The agricultural supply chains serving those 8 billion people are more globally integrated, meaning more efficient in normal conditions and more simultaneously exposed in abnormal ones. The energy market dependencies embedded in those supply chains are, if anything, more complex and more geopolitically constrained than they were in 1973. And the El Niño forecast for 2026 is not moderate. It is, by the current ensemble, a super event comparable to the two most powerful in the modern record. Are we more resilient than 1877? In most of the dimensions that defined Victorian fragility, yes, unambiguously. The humanitarian infrastructure, the early warning systems, the productive capacity of modern agriculture, the legal and institutional frameworks for emergency food assistance, all of these represent genuine advances that matter enormously. Are we more fragile than 1877 in other dimensions? Also yes. In the dimensions of systemic interconnection, input dependency, supply chain optimization, and the cascading propagation of simultaneous multi-regional stress through globally integrated markets, we have created a system that can fail in ways that the Victorian world, precisely because of its disconnection, could not. The scenario in which the fragile dimensions dominate in 2026 is not so far from the current trajectory that it belongs in the category of science fiction. It belongs in the category of tail risk, low probability, very high consequence, structurally plausible given what we know about how the system works, and tail risks that are structurally plausible in systems as consequential as the global food supply deserve to be named clearly and taken seriously, not because panic serves anyone, but because the difference between a managed stress event and an unmanaged cascade is almost always preparation, and preparation requires first acknowledging that the risk is real. 1877 is a data point, a terrible, enormous, sobering data point about what happens when climate systems align against human systems that are not prepared for the convergence. We have more preparation now. The question is whether we have enough. Part Mubei, the 3.5 to 4.0 parts per million scenario. Let us talk about a specific number, a number that is not yet real, not yet recorded, not yet confirmed, but that scientists watching the carbon cycle are going to be monitoring very carefully starting in the second half of 2026 and extending into 2027. A number that will not make the front page of any newspaper when it arrives, that will not be announced in a press conference, that will not generate the kind of immediate visceral reaction that a flood video or a wildfire photograph generates. It will appear in a data set. It will be discussed in a paper, and if it lands where the worst-case scenarios suggest it could, it will quietly change the mathematics of everything. That number is 3.5 to 4.0 parts per million per year, the annual growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide. To understand why that range matters, you need to understand what it is being measured against and where the measurement comes from. The Mauna Loa Observatory sits at roughly 3,400 meters above sea level on the slopes of a volcano on the Big Island of Hawaii. It was chosen for atmospheric monitoring in the 1950s precisely because of its remoteness, far from industrial centers, far from dense vegetation, high enough in the atmosphere to sample air that represents something close to the global average, rather than any local source or sink. Since 1958, it has been recording atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations continuously, producing what is now known as the Keeling curve, named after the scientist Charles David Keeling, who established the monitoring program, the longest continuous record of atmospheric carbon dioxide in existence. That record shows, with unmistakable clarity, two things happening simultaneously: the seasonal oscillation of carbon dioxide rising through the northern hemisphere winter as vegetation dies back and absorbs less carbon, falling through the northern hemisphere summer as vegetation grows and absorbs more, riding on top of a steadily rising long-term trend driven by human fossil fuel emissions. The trend has been rising for 67 years without interruption. What has changed over those 67 years is the rate of rise. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the annual growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide averaged roughly 1.0 to 1.2 parts per million per year. Through the 1980s and 90s, it climbed toward 1.5 to 1.8. Through the 2000s and 2010s, it pushed toward 2.2 to 2.5. Over the past decade, the background rate, excluding El Niño spike years, has been running at approximately 2.4 to 2.8 parts per million per year. The acceleration of the trend reflects the acceleration of global emissions, but it also reflects the incremental weakening of the carbon sink that absorbs those emissions. Both factors are pushing the number upward over time. The El Niño spike years stand out clearly in the Keeling curve record as temporary departures above the trend. In 1998, following the peak of the 1997 to 1998 Super El Niño, the growth rate spiked significantly above trend before returning toward the baseline in subsequent years. In 2016, following the peak of the 2015 to 2016 event, the growth rate reached 3.05 parts per million, the highest annual reading in the entire observational record at that point. Then it dropped back. The spike was visible. The recovery was visible. The system appeared to absorb the event and return toward its trajectory. In 2023 and 2024, something worth noting happened even without a super El Niño in place. The growth rates came in at the high end of recent experience, somewhere in the 2.8 to 3.2 range, depending on the specific measurement period, driven by the combination of record global temperatures, the Amazon drought of 2023, and the general baseline warming of the system. Those numbers are not El Niño spike numbers, they are new normal numbers. The trend line itself has shifted upward. Now place the 2026 El Niño forecast on top of that already elevated baseline. The ensemble peak of plus 2.0 to plus 2.75 degrees Celsius in the Niño 3.4 region. The multi-basin configuration, adding heat stress from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans simultaneously. The southeastern Amazon already operating as a net carbon source before the event begins. The Indonesian peatlands structurally primed for ignition after decades of drainage and 2 previous fire events. The soil moisture deficit across the broader Amazon basin from the 2023 drought still not fully recovered, and the Congo basin as a wild card that the monitoring infrastructure cannot adequately characterize in advance. Run those inputs through the logic of what happened in 2015 to 2016, adjusted for the worst starting conditions, and a growth rate in the range of 3.5 to 4.0 parts per million becomes a plausible outcome. Not the central estimate, not a certainty. The central estimate is probably somewhere in the 3.0 to 3.5 range, roughly consistent with a severe event on a degraded baseline. But the upper end of the plausible range, the scenario in which multiple failure mechanisms operate simultaneously, as they did in 2015 but from a weaker starting position, reaches into territory that has never been recorded in the 67-year history of the Mauna Loa dataset. Let that sit for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. 67 years of continuous measurement, the entire era of modern climate science, the entire period during which the world has been burning fossil fuels at industrial scale and tracking the atmospheric consequences. In all of that time, across every El Niño, every volcanic eruption, every extreme weather year, the growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide has never reached 3.5 parts per million in a single year. A 3.5 to 4.0 reading in 2027 would be genuinely unprecedented. It would sit outside the envelope of everything the observational record has shown us. And here is the part that should concern you more than the number itself. It would not just be a bad year for the carbon budget. It would be a diagnostic signal, a measurement that tells you something specific and important about the state of the system generating it. Because the growth rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide is not just an output, it is an indicator of the balance between two things: how much carbon humanity is emitting and how much the natural world is absorbing. If emissions are relatively stable and the global clean energy transition, while insufficient, has at least been slowing the growth of emissions, and the growth rate spikes dramatically, the spike is telling you that the absorption side of the equation has weakened. The sink failed, not completely, not permanently perhaps, but measurably, significantly, in ways that the number makes impossible to ignore. The clean energy transition has been the central organizing project of global climate policy for the past decade. Solar deployment has been extraordinary, genuinely, surprisingly fast, faster than almost anyone predicted in 2015. Wind capacity has expanded. Coal consumption in developed economies has declined. Electric vehicle adoption has accelerated. Battery storage costs have fallen precipitously. These are real achievements. They represent enormous investment, political effort, technological progress, and genuine reductions in the rate of carbon dioxide emissions relative to what would have happened without them. A 3.5 to 4.0 parts per million reading in 2027 would represent the erasure of a significant fraction of those gains, not in the sense that the clean energy infrastructure disappears, but in the sense that the carbon accounting impact of years of transition effort gets overwhelmed in a single year by the failure of the biological buffer that was supposed to be supporting that transition from the other side. Every solar panel installed since 2015, every coal plant retired, every internal combustion engine replaced by an electric motor, the cumulative carbon benefit of all of it, cancelled out, and then some, by 12 months of forest and soil failure, driven by a climate event that the system was no longer resilient enough to absorb cleanly. That is not an argument against the clean energy transition. It is an argument for understanding what the transition is actually racing against. The standard framing of climate policy is that we are racing against our own emissions, that the task is to cut human carbon dioxide output fast enough to stay within the remaining carbon budget before crossing 2 degrees of global warming. That framing is correct, but it is incomplete. We are also racing against the degradation of the natural systems that have been buying us time by absorbing half of what we emit. Those systems are not a fixed asset. They are a living, stressed, incrementally weakening buffer that has been quietly subsidizing the climate policy timeline for decades. And a 3.5 to 4.0 reading would be the clearest possible signal that the subsidy is becoming unreliable. The carbon budget, the total cumulative carbon dioxide emissions the world can still produce before crossing 2 degrees of warming with high probability, gets revised periodically as the science improves. The current estimates from the IPCC place the remaining budget at somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide from 2023 onward, depending on the probability threshold you are aiming for. That sounds like a lot, until you note that the world currently emits roughly 37 gigatons per year, which means the budget runs out in somewhere between 5 and 8 years at current emission rates. The margin is already extremely thin. A year in which the carbon sink weakens enough to add an extra 1 to 2 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere, the kind of number implied by a 3.5 to 4.0 growth rate reading, tightens that margin further. Not catastrophically in a single year, but meaningfully. And the models used to calculate that budget do not currently assume this kind of sink failure. If the models need to be revised, if the sink is weaker, more vulnerable, and less reliable than they assumed, the policy targets built on those models need to be revised too. The net zero timelines, the temperature pathway projections, the assumptions about how much natural carbon absorption can be counted on to soften the consequences of the emissions that the transition has not yet eliminated. All of it gets tighter. This is the number to watch. Not because it will tell you the floods are bad or the droughts are severe. You will know that from the news, and it will be covered extensively, but because it will tell you something the news will not tell you. Whether the system that has been quietly saving us is still doing its job. Whether the invisible infrastructure of the planet's carbon cycle is holding under the greatest stress it has faced in the history of human observation. Whether the buffer is intact. The number will appear in a dataset update sometime in 2027. It will not trend on social media. It will not be the lead story. But it will be, in a very real sense, one of the most important numbers measured in human history. And the scientists watching for it already know what they are hoping not to see. Part 10. Permanent Amazon Flip Hypothesis. Thomas Lovejoy spent decades studying the Amazon. Carlos Nobre has spent decades studying the Amazon. They are not fringe scientists working at the margins of their discipline, publishing in obscure journals, making claims that the mainstream considers implausible. They are among the most respected and cited figures in tropical ecology, scientists whose work has shaped the field, whose findings have informed policy at the highest levels, and whose reputations rest on decades of careful, empirically grounded research. When they published a paper together in 2018, arguing that the Amazon rainforest may be approaching a point of no return, it was not a provocation. It was a warning from two people who had spent their careers earning the right to issue it. The paper argued that the Amazon is approaching a tipping point, a threshold beyond which the self-reinforcing feedbacks between deforestation, reduced rainfall, and forest dieback become self-sustaining, initiating a permanent transition of the world's largest tropical rainforest towards something that resembles the Cerrado, the fire-adapted savanna biome that currently borders the Amazon to the south and east. Not a forest, not a carbon sink, a fundamentally different ecosystem with fundamentally different properties, incapable of performing the functions that the intact Amazon currently performs for the global climate system. The threshold they identified is somewhere around 20 to 25% total deforestation of the original Amazon extent. That is the level at which, in their model, the moisture recycling system that sustains the interior of the basin breaks down sufficiently to initiate the self-reinforcing transition. Below that threshold, the system has enough intact forest to maintain the rainfall recycling that keeps the interior wet enough to resist transition. Above it, the feedback takes over and the direction of travel becomes, for practical purposes, irreversible on any human-relevant timescale. The current cumulative deforestation of the Amazon, the total area of original forest cover that has been cleared, burned, or degraded since the beginning of large-scale human land use in the basin, is somewhere between 17 and 20%, depending on how you define deforestation, which satellite data product you use, and whether you include degraded forest that is still standing but has lost significant ecological function. The gap between where we are and where Lovejoy and Nobre place the threshold is not a comfortable margin. It is, in some analyses and in some regions of the basin, not a margin at all. In the southeastern Amazon, the region that Luciana Gatti's aircraft sampling study identified as already a net carbon source in normal years, the local deforestation rate is significantly above the basin-wide average. That region has not just approached the threshold, it has, by several measures, already crossed its local version of it. To understand why this threshold exists, why the Amazon cannot simply lose forest gradually and indefinitely without triggering a systemic transition, you need to understand something about how the Amazon makes its own weather. This is not a metaphor, it is a physical process that has been measured, modeled, and documented extensively over the past 4 decades. The Amazon rainforest transpires enormous quantities of water. The trees draw groundwater and soil moisture through their roots, transport it upward through their vascular systems, and release it as water vapor through tiny pores in their leaves called stomata. A single large Amazonian tree can transpire hundreds of liters of water per day. Multiply that by the 400 billion or so trees in the intact Amazon basin, and you get a moisture flux that is genuinely staggering. Estimates suggest the Amazon releases somewhere between 7 and 8 trillion liters of water into the atmosphere every single day through evapotranspiration. That moisture does not just disappear into the upper atmosphere, it condenses, it forms clouds, it falls as rain, not necessarily directly above where it evaporated, but carried westward and southward by atmospheric circulation, watering the forests further downwind. The trees in the western and southern Amazon are, to a significant degree, drinking water that was originally transpired by the trees to the east and north. The forest waters itself. Researchers have given this process a name that captures its scale and importance: flying rivers. The atmospheric rivers of moisture generated by Amazonian evapotranspiration carry more water than the Amazon River itself carries to the sea. They are the invisible hydraulic system that keeps the interior of the continent wet enough to support a rainforest rather than a savanna, and they are entirely dependent on the trees that generate them. Remove enough trees, and the flying rivers weaken. Less evapotranspiration means less moisture recycled into the atmosphere, means less rainfall over the interior, means more drought, stress on the remaining trees, means reduced evapotranspiration, means less rainfall. A self-reinforcing feedback loop running in the wrong direction. The system can tolerate some deforestation without triggering this feedback because the remaining forest is still large enough to maintain sufficient moisture flux. But there is a threshold, the 20 to 25% figure that Lovejoy and Nobre identified, at which the remaining forest is no longer large enough to sustain the flying river system at the level needed to maintain interior rainfall above the minimum required to support rainforest vegetation. Cross that threshold, and the feedback takes over. What the transition looks like in practice is important to understand, because it does not look like what most people imagine when they think of a catastrophic ecosystem collapse. It does not look like a sudden die-off. It does not look like a wall of fire moving across the continent in a single season. It looks, at first, like what is already happening in the southeastern Amazon: more drought years, more forest mortality, more fires in areas that historically were too wet to burn, more replacement of moisture-dependent rainforest trees by fire-adapted grasses and shrubs from the Cerrado. The footprint of degradation expands incrementally. Year by year, the boundary between intact forest and degraded or transitioning forest moves westward and northward. The process is gradual enough that in any given year, it does not look like catastrophe. It looks like a bad drought year, then another bad drought year, then another. The insidious thing about threshold systems is that the transition can be well underway before the data makes it unambiguous. The satellite record will show it eventually, expanding areas of net carbon release, increasing canopy mortality rates, fire occurrence in historically moist zones, phenological shifts in the timing of leaf flush and senescence that indicate vegetation type change. But the process that is driving those signals, the breakdown of the flying river system, the shift in the moisture balance of the interior basin, could be irreversibly committed before the surface signals are clear enough to constitute definitive proof. You may only know the tipping point was crossed after the data from the following decade makes the trajectory unmistakable. And by then, the physics of the water cycle has taken over. Stopping deforestation at that point does not reverse the process. The remaining forest is too small to restore the flying river system to the level needed to pull the interior back from the drier equilibrium it is settling into. This is the specific mechanism through which 2026 could function as a trigger, and it is important to be precise about what trigger means here, because it does not mean cause in the simple sense. The 2026 El Niño would not be the cause of Amazon dieback the way a match is the cause of a fire. The cause is the accumulated deforestation of 17 to 20% of the original basin, the decades of moisture recycling degradation, the background warming that has been drying the system incrementally for decades, the soil moisture deficit from the 2023 drought that the basin is still carrying. All of that is the fuel. The 2026 El Niño is the additional stress that could push additional areas of the basin across the local threshold that the southeastern Amazon has already crossed, expanding the zone of committed transition, potentially pushing the basin-wide deforestation equivalent past the point where the flying river system can recover, even if all remaining deforestation stopped immediately. The scientific literature does not say this will happen. It is important to say that clearly, because the Lovejoy-Nobre hypothesis, while widely respected, is not unanimously accepted, and the precise location of the tipping threshold remains an active area of research with genuine uncertainty. Some models place the threshold higher than 20 to 25%. Some argue that the system has more resilience than the flying river model implies. The debate is real and scientifically legitimate, but here is what the debate is not about. It is not about whether the threshold exists. The existence of a tipping threshold in the Amazon moisture recycling system is not seriously contested. The debate is about where exactly it sits and how close we are to it. And given that the southeastern Amazon has already crossed its local version, given that basin-wide deforestation is somewhere in the range of 17 to 20% against a threshold estimate of 20 to 25, given that the 2026 El Niño is about to add the most severe single-year moisture stress to the system since before the satellite era, the range of that uncertainty is not reassuring. The error bars on the threshold estimate do not point away from danger, they bracket it. We may only recognize that the transition has truly begun years after it starts. The signal will build in the satellite data incrementally. a few more percentage points of net carbon release, a few more degrees of canopy temperature elevation, a few more hectares of fire occurrence in historically wet zones. Each individual signal will be explicable as a bad drought year, a local anomaly, a temporary disturbance. The pattern will take years to become undeniable, and the process driving that pattern may already be irreversible by the time the pattern is undeniable. That is the nature of threshold systems. That is why Lovejoy and Nobre wrote their paper in 2018 rather than waiting for certainty. Certainty in a system like this arrives too late to act on. Part 19. The compound tipping corridor. The Amazon is not the only system in the vicinity of a tipping point, and this is where the story stops being a rainforest carbon accounting problem and starts being something that is genuinely difficult to scope, not because the science is speculative, but because the interactions between the systems involved are complex enough that even the researchers who study them most carefully are reluctant to make confident quantitative predictions about how a cascade would unfold. The honest answer to the question of what happens if multiple tipping elements begin to interact is that we do not fully know. What we do know is enough to take the question very seriously. The science of tipping points in the Earth system is not settled, and any account that pretends otherwise is doing the reader a disservice. There is genuine and legitimate scientific debate about exactly what constitutes a tipping element, a component of the Earth system that can transition relatively abruptly from one state to another in response to a forcing that crosses a threshold. There is debate about where the thresholds lie for specific systems, how confident we should be in any particular estimate, and how rapidly a tipped system transitions to its new state. The uncertainty ranges on some of these thresholds are wide. The models used to estimate them have known limitations. Reasonable scientists look at the same data and reach different conclusions about how close specific systems are to their critical points. These disagreements are not a sign of a broken science. They are a sign of a science working at the frontier of what is currently knowable. But within that uncertainty, a body of literature has been growing steadily over the past decade, receiving considerably more attention in the most recent IPCC 6th Assessment Report than it did in previous cycles, that argues for something beyond just the individual tipping elements considered in isolation. The argument is that these elements are not independent of each other. They are connected through physical, chemical, and biological pathways. And when one tips, it does not just matter for that system. It loads additional stress onto other systems, shifting their probability distributions toward their own thresholds. The result is what researchers variously call a tipping cascade or a tipping corridor, a regime in which the destabilization of one system measurably increases the probability of destabilization in others, even if the connections are indirect and the timescales are different. A 2018 paper in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, authored by Will Steffen, Johan Rockström, and colleagues, introduced the concept of hothouse Earth, a scenario in which a series of tipping elements cascade in sequence, driven partly by human forcing and partly by the internal feedbacks between tipping systems, pushing the planet toward a dramatically warmer equilibrium that no amount of emissions reduction could reverse once underway. The paper was controversial when it was published, criticized by some for overstating the certainty of cascade dynamics and for presenting a worst-case scenario without sufficient qualification. Those criticisms have merit. The hothouse Earth scenario is not a prediction, it is a risk framing, an attempt to characterize the outer boundary of what coupled system dynamics could produce. But the core physical argument that tipping elements are connected and that their connections matter has held up and strengthened in the literature since 2018. Let us walk through the specific systems that researchers have identified as most relevant to the 2026 story, because each one is in a different state of stress and proximity to its threshold, and together they form a picture that is worth understanding clearly. Start with the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC. This is the large-scale ocean current system that functions as a conveyor belt for heat in the Atlantic basin, drawing warm surface water northward from the tropics, releasing that heat to the atmosphere over the North Atlantic and northwestern Europe, and returning cold, dense, saline water southward at depth. It is the reason that Western Europe has a significantly milder climate than its latitude would otherwise suggest. London sits at roughly the same latitude as Calgary, and its climate is dramatically warmer because of the heat exported northward by the AMOC. The AMOC has been weakening. Multiple lines of evidence, ocean temperature fingerprints, salinity measurements, direct current monitoring through the rapid array, and proxy reconstructions from sediment cores converge on the conclusion that the AMOC is currently running at its weakest level in at least 1,000 years, and possibly much longer. The primary driver is the influx of fresh water from melting Greenland ice into the North Atlantic, which reduces the salinity and therefore the density of the surface water that needs to sink to drive the circulation. Less sinking means weaker, overturning means weaker heat transport. A 2021 study published in Nature Climate Change, analysing indirect indicators of AMOC's strength over the past century, concluded that the circulation may be approaching a critical transition, a tipping point beyond which it would collapse to a much weaker state. That conclusion is contested. Other researchers argue that the system has more stability than the proxy indicators suggest, and that a full collapse is unlikely within this century under plausible emissions scenarios. The debate is ongoing, but the direction of travel, weakening AMOC in response to Greenland melt, is not contested. What is contested is how close to the threshold it currently sits. Why does AMOC matter for the 2026 story? Because a weakening AMOC changes the heat distribution of the Atlantic basin in ways that directly affect the moisture and temperature conditions over the Amazon and tropical Africa. As we discussed earlier, a warm Atlantic is one of the amplifying factors in the multi-basin configuration that makes 2026 more dangerous for tropical forests than a simple Pacific El Niño would be. The weakening AMOC contributes to Atlantic surface warming by reducing the export of tropical heat northward, bottling warmth in the tropical Atlantic that would otherwise be redistributed. It is a feedback pathway that connects the ice melt story to the forest stress story through ocean heat distribution. Move to the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets. These are the two largest reservoirs of land-based ice on Earth, and their potential contribution to sea level rise is the most commonly discussed consequence of their instability, but their relevance to the tipping cascade story goes beyond sea level. The Greenland ice sheet is already losing mass at an accelerating rate. The meltwater flowing into the North Atlantic is the primary driver of AMOC weakening. The West Antarctic ice sheet, according to several analyses published in the past 5 years, has already passed a threshold of committed retreat in key glacier systems, meaning that even if atmospheric warming stopped today, the ice sheet dynamics already underway would continue to drive retreat and mass loss for centuries. The commitment is not reversible on human timescales. The connection from ice sheet loss to the carbon sink story runs through the AMOC pathway and through the overall warming acceleration that additional sea level rise and ice albedo feedback contributes to. Less ice means less reflection of solar radiation back to space, which means more warming absorbed at the surface, which means more stress on every temperature-sensitive system, including the tropical forests. Arctic permafrost is perhaps the most direct parallel to the tropical carbon sink story, because it is itself a carbon reservoir, and it is already failing. The permanently frozen soils of the Arctic and subarctic contain an estimated 1.5 trillion tons of organic carbon, accumulated over thousands of years of cold conditions that prevented decomposition. As Arctic temperatures rise, at roughly 2 to 4 times the global average warming rate due to Arctic amplification, the permafrost thaws. Thawed soil is colonized by decomposing microbes. Organic carbon that has been frozen for millennia is broken down, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas in the short term, roughly 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. The permafrost carbon feedback is already operating. Measurements from monitoring networks across Siberia, Alaska, and Canada show permafrost thaw rates and carbon release rates that are ahead of where most models predicted they would be at current temperatures. The system is not waiting for some future warming threshold. It is responding now, incrementally, in ways that are adding to atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations above and beyond what human fossil fuel emissions account for. The permafrost feedback and the tropical carbon sink failure are not the same story. They operate through different mechanisms on different timescales in different geographic locations, but they are additive. Both are natural carbon reservoirs that are transitioning from net absorbers or neutral systems toward net emitters, and both are doing so in response to the same underlying warming that 2026 will accelerate. The Indian summer monsoon completes the picture of interconnected system stress. The monsoon is driven by the temperature differential between the rapidly heating Asian landmass and the Indian Ocean. El Niño weakens it by reducing that differential. AMOC weakening affects it through changes in Atlantic sea surface temperatures that alter the global atmospheric circulation patterns that set up the monsoon. Aerosol loading from industrial activity and biomass burning in South and Southeast Asia adds another layer of disruption. And the monsoon, as we discussed in the agricultural fragility section, underpins the food security of more than 1 billion people. Its instability is not just an ecological problem, it is a human systems problem of the first order. The carbon sink failure that a 2026 super El Niño could trigger sits at the center of this network of interconnected systems, not because it is the largest or most dramatic of the tipping risks, but because it is the connection point, the thread that links the forest story to the ice story, to the ocean circulation story, to the monsoon story. A weakened carbon sink means faster accumulation of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Faster accumulation means faster warming. Faster warming means more. Greenland melt means weaker. AMOC means warmer. Tropical Atlantic means more. Forest stress. Faster warming means faster. Permafrost. Thaw means more. Methane means faster warming. Faster warming means more ice sheet. Mass loss means more sea level rise, means more coastal disruption, means more pressure on already stressed human systems. None of these feedbacks operates on the timescale of a single El Niño event. The cascade, if it is underway, will unfold over decades, which is precisely why it is so difficult to communicate and so easy to dismiss in any given year as not yet constituting an emergency. The emergency does not announce itself with a single catastrophic event. It announces itself through a gradual but accelerating shift in the baseline conditions of the entire system. A shift that, once far enough advanced, becomes self-sustaining in ways that no subsequent human action can fully reverse. This is why the question of carbon sink recovery after 2026 is not a technical footnote for specialists. It is a question about which of two qualitatively different planetary trajectories we are on. One trajectory maintains enough system stability for the clean energy transition to be meaningful, for the emissions reductions being achieved to actually translate into reduced warming, for the carbon budget math to remain tractable, for the tipping elements to remain below their thresholds long enough for human civilization to adapt. The other trajectory enters a period of coupled system destabilization, in which the feedbacks between tipping elements begin to drive warming faster than human emissions reductions can offset, in which we are no longer primarily racing against our own emissions, but against the Earth system's own internal dynamics. Those are not equivalent outcomes, they are different worlds, and the difference between them may depend, in meaningful part, on what the carbon cycle data shows in 2027, on whether the forests held, on whether the system that has been saving us is still capable of doing so. Part Haimui, the final unknown. We have been here before, twice, and both times the system came back. In 1998, as the atmospheric carbon dioxide growth rate spiked and the Indonesian peat fires were finally extinguished by the returning monsoon rains, scientists watched the data with a mixture of relief and unease. The carbon cycle recovered. The the growth rate dropped back toward its trend line. The event was filed as a severe, but ultimately transient disruption. The system had been pushed hard and had returned. In 2016, as the OCO2 satellite continued its orbit and the global carbon dioxide growth record of 3.05 parts per million was recorded, and then the following year showed a significant drop back toward normal, the same story was told. Severe, unprecedented, but the system recovered. The Amazon regreened as the rains returned. The fire season in Indonesia, while terrible, eventually ended. The African soil respiration anomaly faded as temperatures normalized. The carbon sink came back online. Cautious relief, update the models, move on. Both of those recoveries happened in a different world than the one we are standing in now. They happened when the southeastern Amazon was still a functioning carbon sink. They happened when the Indonesian peatlands had not yet been burned twice in 2 decades on top of 40 years of drainage. They happened when the soil moisture reserves of the Amazon had not been depleted by the worst drought in recorded history just 2 or 3 years prior. They happened before the background warming of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean basins had all reached the levels they are at today. 2026 is the first test of the system under these conditions, not conditions that the models have been extensively validated against, not conditions that have any clean historical analogue in the instrumental record, conditions that are, in the relevant respects, genuinely novel. The observational tools we now have are extraordinary. OCO2 is still operational, joined by newer instruments with improved spatial resolution. A network of ground-based atmospheric monitoring stations spans the Amazon, covers Southeast Asia, and reaches into the Congo Basin. Geostationary satellites track fire events in near real time. Flux tower networks measure the carbon exchange between the atmosphere and specific forest sites continuously. If the sink fails in 2026, we will know it faster and in greater detail than we knew anything about the 1997 or 2015 events. The data will be unambiguous. The geographic fingerprinting will be precise. What we do not know, what no observational network, however sophisticated, can tell us in advance, is where the system's resilience actually ends. The precise threshold at which the ratchet effect produces incomplete recovery rather than full recovery. The exact deforestation percentage at which the Amazon's moisture recycling begins an irreversible decline. The specific warming increment at which the Indonesian peatlands' residual hydrology fails to suppress fire across entire regions, regardless of rainfall. These thresholds exist. The science says they must exist, but they are not labeled. They do not announce themselves. They are crossed and then recognized in the data, and then the conversation changes in a way it cannot unchange. The 2026 El Niño will be documented exhaustively. The flood stories will be written, the drought maps will be published, the economic damage assessments will be compiled, the carbon dioxide growth rate will be measured with precision at Mauna Loa and at dozens of other stations around the world, and sometime in 2027, researchers will publish papers on what the carbon cycle data from 2026 shows. That data will either show a severe but ultimately temporary disruption, another spike, another recovery, another update to the models, another narrow escape, or it will show something different. It will show a spike that does not fully retrace, a growth rate that drops after the event but settles onto a measurably higher baseline than before, a southeastern Amazon that is not recovering its sink function, an Indonesian region where the fire signal is larger than in 2015 despite improved suppression efforts, a Congo signal that was not present in 2015, a compound failure across multiple systems that adds up to a total carbon release and a carbon sink weakening that is not consistent with the model's predictions of full recovery. If that second scenario is what the data shows, the conversation in climate science and climate policy will be forced to reckon with something it has been reluctant to confront: the possibility that the natural buffer that has been quietly absorbing half of human emissions for the past several decades is no longer reliable at the scale we have been counting on, not gone, not destroyed overnight, but degraded to the point where the math of what we can still emit before crossing the temperature thresholds that the Paris Agreement set out to avoid is significantly tighter than anyone's current plans assume. That is not a small thing. That is not a scientific footnote. That is a fundamental alteration of the operating conditions of the entire global climate response. Every carbon budget calculation, every net zero timeline, every scenario assessment that informs international climate negotiations. All of it built on an assumption about the carbon sink that the 2026 data will either confirm or call into question. We have seen the system fail twice. 1997, 2015. Both times, it came back. Both times, we updated our understanding, absorbed the lessons, and continued. Both times, there was a next time. 2026 is different not because it is certainly catastrophic. It is different because, for the first time in the era of modern observation, we are testing a system that has been pushed harder, stressed longer, damaged more extensively, and given less time to recover than at any previous moment in the history of human climate forcing. We are testing whether the resilience we have been relying on, the resilience of the Amazon, of the Indonesian peatlands, of the African forests, of the ocean surface, is genuine and robust, or whether it has been a slowly diminishing asset that we have been spending down without noticing. The forests of the tropics have been absorbing our mistakes for centuries, longer probably. They are extraordinary systems, adaptive, resilient, ancient. The carbon locked in the peat of Borneo has been there since before the Roman Empire. The trees of the intact Amazon have been cycling water and carbon since before the first human settlement. They are not fragile. They are not about to collapse from a single season of drought. But they are not infinite, and they are not recovering the way they used to. And the rate at which we are drawing on their resilience, the rate at which we are pushing them with warming, with drought, with deforestation, with the compounding frequency of extreme events, is higher than it has ever been. The forecast says 61% probability of El Niño onset by July. The ensemble range says plus 2.0 to plus 2.75 degrees Celsius in the Niño 3.4 region. The satellites are watching. The monitoring networks are recording. The scientists are watching the numbers. And somewhere in the Amazon, in a forest that has already been breathing harder than usual for the past 2 years, in soil that is drier than it should be, in a watershed where the rivers ran lower than they have ever run, the trees are waiting for the rain. They have always come through before. That is what the data shows. And that is, perhaps, the most important thing to hold on to as you watch what happens next. But it is also, now, the thing we can no longer afford to simply assume.